So we're going? Yeah. Yep. Okay. So we might start looking then at the real Indian theologies. Starting with the religion that I guess takes us most obviously from primal through to, you know, a modern, universal kind of a religion in Hinduism. And as I said before, I mean, you could do a whole degree on Hinduism. There's so much here. But we just want to continue looking at this notion of other and how they manage it. At last count, something like 330 million gods. I think it's just a kind of a way of saying, well, there's a hell of a lot of gods there. There's almost as many gods as people. And it's just a way of capturing, I suppose, the total kind of deification, animisation, cum deification of the Hindu world. Everything is spirited with a god. But again, the notion of the god has developed over time. So from very basic animistic sorts of belief, through time, the gods just multiply as the population multiplies. So we could refer to it as a deism extraordinaire, and I guess enter the very rancorous debate about whether Hinduism is best understood as polytheistic, meaning just many, in this case, many gods, pantheistic, as in God is just imbued, godliness is imbued within the world. The world is saturated with godliness. Or indeed, is it monotheistic? Is there one God? And it's a bit of all of that. But just concentrating on the monotheism, Hinduism is described sometimes as a sort of a moderate monotheism. And we've got to be a little bit careful of that phrase because it's often cast by Western-based scholars who that little inclination to sort of say, oh yeah, well it's sort of monotheistic, but of course not monotheistic like, you know, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Certainly there is a sense of monotheism. Of all those 330 million gods, there's Brahman, sometimes referred to, and the story varies, Prajapati. One God, a supreme being, the ultimate reality, the thing about which it all is, the source of it all and the end of it all. Life is about being issued from Brahman and finding our way back to Brahman, normally through many lives, depending on which particular caste one's born into on this particular journey. But Brahman takes many deistic forms. Brahman sort of issues. It's all Brahman really. It's all Prajapati, but it takes all these 330 million forms for different purposes. There truly are families of gods in Hinduism. Gods and goddesses marry, they have children, they live lives like ours. But it's all really an expression of Brahman as ultimate. Another interesting way of capturing Hindu monotheism is as a trinity. The one little reference in my own theology degree a long time ago, which was largely Christian and not even terribly broadly Christian. It was a good degree, but it was fairly narrow. But the one reference that was made to a non-Christian religion was made by the guy that I studied the Trinity with. And he referred, I thought rather openly for those days, to the fact that the notion of Trinity of Gods is not a Christian invention, as people are inclined to think. There's quite a number, as I showed you with the pre-Incas, there's that notion of Trinity for some reason, the Trinity of Gods, or the God expressing him, her, itself in some Trinitarian form. But the Trinity in Hinduism is between Brahman, Vishnu and Shiva. And Vishnu and Shiva tend to, a little bit like Sunni and Shia in Islam, characterise the one big division. If there's one big division in Hinduism, it is between the Vaishnavites and the Shaivites. So they all believe in Brahman, but they identify with one or other of Brahman's most popular, most overarching issues, deistic issues. So Brahman is the supernatural other, and commonly yoga. Yoga as a prayer form, as a total kind of physical, manipulative form, is the main way. Particularly Raj Yoga holds the promise of being able to connect with Brahman directly, as one is struggling through the many, many rebirths. One can, through Raj Yoga, connect, at least momentarily, when one's fully entranced in Raj Yoga. So it becomes, if you like, almost the equivalent for the individual Hindu in their life of what magic was for a lot of the primal peoples. As I suggest, Hinduism is such an interesting religion. It had such influence on the modern world. But, for the theologian, its great interest is that it takes us on the journey from a very ancient primal form all the way through to its influence in the world today, the amazing kind of power that it's had over so many parts of the world. I was going to show you this. We won't have time today, but watch it. It's a nice little summary of Hinduism, particularly around the gods. The great issue of Hinduism, of course, is Buddhism. Siddhartha, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was Hindu. One of his struggles, one of the things that led to him achieving enlightenment in the way he did and becoming the Buddha was in going all the way with the Hindu quest, becoming a Hindu monk, a Hindu ascetic. He tried that, and then he tried lascivious life, living it up life, and finding enlightenment ultimately was through finding what's called in Buddhism the middle way between those two extremes, and that's what Buddhism's all about. Finding the middle path between the extremes. That's the only place where we can find contentment. Big questions about Buddhism, whether we can use the word theology at all, because a lot of people would say, well, Buddhism is atheistic. It has no God. So if there's no God, there's no other, you can't have theology. Well, let's enter into that debate. Certainly there's a reaction one can see quite clearly in Buddhism to Hinduism. Siddhartha was in a way reacting to his particularly his Hindu upbringing, his Hindu set of beliefs. And in the end what he did was break through the trap of the cycle of rebirth. In becoming enlightened in the way he did, he was able to reach moksha, or what became termed in Buddhism nirvana, immediately, in one lifetime. One could achieve enlightenment, one could reach the end, one could reach Brahman, but we're not talking about Brahman, because in a way he'd done away with the notion of Brahman. One could reach the same end as the Hindu, but could do it immediately and in one life through this intense reflection and meditation. In its original form, yeah, it's a liberation from Hinduism. It's a kind of an atheistic reaction to, you know, if you grow up 330 million gods, I guess, you know, the idea of there being no God perhaps would seem like a bit of blessed relief, at least for a while. But a lot of the core of Hinduism is still there, the notion of the inner self reaching another place, another state. So people would say, well, Nirvana was really moksha. If there's moksha, then really Brahman was there. You know, what's in a word? God or no God, it's the same concept, it's the same sense of other. You know, the end of life is to reach other. It's not just to die and rot away, it's to reach an other place, nirvana. So, you know, was God really still there? That's the endless debate that rattles around in Buddhism. And Jainism is a very interesting, much smaller tradition that comes out of Hinduism around about the same time as Buddhism. Mahavira is the founder of Jainism. This is the religion that influenced Mahatma Gandhi so much. He was Hindu, but it was the Jain extreme belief in non-violence. You know, I've seen him up in Rajasthan, which is heavily Jain territory, where the Delwara temple is their great sacred site. The very strict Jain, walking along the street, gauze over their face lest they swallow a fly or even a tiny little, you know, insect, and brushing the road as they go in front of them lest they tread on an ant. It's that extreme sense that everything around you is sacred, everything is sacralised, everything is, in a sense, godly. And so, you know, what Mahavira seemed to craft was another escape, perhaps, from the endless cycle of Hinduism, especially if you're of the lower caste and really had no chance of reaching moksha in this lifetime. He found a sort of another middle way, sort of between this Hindu mono or polytheism and Buddhist atheism, where the human quest was actually yourself to become a god. There was no Brahman as such, but you, in a sense, could become Brahman. Each of us could, by living this extremely non-violent life. So the notion of other is very much still there, and the way of manipulating other is through this extreme non-violence.
The thing is, though, I've studied those three religions, and the idea of other is very different to the way you're describing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much with consciousness that's in here rather than being something that you're trying to get to. But, it's got a much more orientated on the inner consciousness. But, yeah, but it is. I do know what you're saying here. But there is a difference between the concept there.
Ah, yes. There's lots of differences. I suppose, you know, the debate I'd have is consciousness about what.
Well, that's it. There's no consciousness. It's just consciousness.
Yeah.
What you witness.
But I'd say in Hinduism especially, there is consciousness, very much consciousness. It's an incorporated consciousness about other, about something out there. But there are different ideas on these things, you know, very different ideas, and would depend on who's teaching it and all of those, yeah. These are the debates that just go round and round. But thank you for sharing that. Okay, briefly Asian theologies. Now, has anyone studied these before? Briefly Asian theologies. Shinto, of course, is the great Japanese religion. It's a primal religion. It takes us back to the beginnings of indigenous Japanese life. Essentially a kind of a nature worshipping religion. It's other in a way. It's a sort of a pantheistic religion. It's clearly other, but very much in the world, of the world. We see a development here in Shinsen, a sort of a spirit kami that inhabits different locations, all the way through to Hanayasu Hiko, a kind of a creator god. Definitely an evolutionary thing perceptible in Shinto. This quite a late development, and possibly even influenced by a lot of, the trading that happened in and out of Japan. Again, we won't look at this in here, but feel free to have a look at it. Quite a good little video. Japanese Buddhism. Buddhism in Japan and China take very, very different forms. Different forms within themselves, but certainly a different form from Buddhism's origins in India. And there's very little debate, or much less debate, about, is Buddhism atheist or not when you get into Asian Buddhism. The Buddha is much more godly. The Buddha himself becomes a bit of a Buddha Amida, a high god virtually. And the end of nirvana is actually to become Buddha, to become with Buddha, to become Buddha. So, much closer to a Western concept of a high god. Nirvana actually includes merging with the Buddha. I'm generalising a little bit here across species of Buddhism, just trying to capture the heart of it. Confucianism, of course, the great religion of China, and I say religion advisedly. You'll read a lot of people suggesting that Confucianism is not a religion and therefore there can't be such a thing as Confucian theology. Well, maybe not. I think, these days more and more we'd want to keep an open mind on some of this. Are there Confucian gods? Not in an obvious sense, not as we'd find it in, among the Taoists, for instance. Is it a religion or a philosophy? Well, the distilled wisdom would say closer to a philosophy than a religion because there aren't any gods. But if one looks more closely at the notion of Ren and Yi, Ren are sort of an extremely intense form of altruism, and Yi an extremely intense form of justice to each other. They take on almost a other form, other aura. They are so much ideal principles that they have to belong, a bit like Plato constructed. The good, the just, the right have to belong to the gods because humans are not capable of that intense level of being good, just and right. You get a similar kind of a thing happening in Confucianism. We can practice altruism, we can practice being just, but we can never really achieve all that ideal principle holds to us. So is that in effect other? Is that in effect their God? Did Confucius himself worship gods and craft these notions out of his sense of God, his sense of other? It would seem that he did. I mean, there's enough evidence around now to say that he definitely did. Is Confucius himself a god? Is one theological question within Confucianism itself, within a revived Confucianism. Confucianism is very much a work in progress. I mean, it was buried for most of the early or the first, several decades of communism, but it's really made a rebirth now, including, among the Communist Party. I mean, the government sponsors the Centre for Confucian Religion began in Beijing in 2005 as a sign of Chinese communism wanting to rediscover its Confucian roots, and part of that had to deal with Confucian religion. These Confucius institutes that have been set up, hundreds of them around the world, including in this university, and one of the central pillars of the Confucius Institutes, a lot of them specialise in, is religion and theology. There's some interesting things happening in our own time. It's a little bit like the astrophysicist, the neuroscientist thing in the West, and here we've got, the communists in the East wanting to rediscover some very ancient roots of who they are, put their lives together in different ways more suitable to the times. And Taoism, the other great religion of China, quite clearly in its indigenous form, nature worshipping. We see again a sort of an evolution of spirit beliefs developing into God beliefs, especially, people would think in reaction to classical Confucianism at least. All the way through to the notion of the Jade Emperor, the High God, the ruler of heaven and earth, popularly known as Grandpa Heaven, who is said to have cultivated Tao. Tao is his way, Taoism is wayism, and Grandpa Heaven was the one who cultivated Wei, and Lao Tzu, the apparent founder of Taoism, was the one who kind of put it down in the text called the Tao Te Ching. There's smackings here of, a revelational text coming from a high God and an agent, like Muhammad in Islam, writes it down so people will have the guiding principle. And so we might just have a look at a little bit of Taoism, about the Tao Te Ching actually. You no doubt know about yin and yang, the balance that's inherent. That's the great Taoist symbol. And probably in modern times there's been a tendency to sort of de-deify Taoism, just as Confucianism is, said to not be godly or theological. So a lot of people have come to say neither is Taoism really, properly understood. It was just a way. It was like Confucianism, just a way. I suppose the big revision that's going on is about just how accurate that was, or was that a sort of a fairly typical Western social scientific reading of those religious traditions. I'm a little bit in that camp, I've got to say. I mean, it seems to me that we are actually, even in Confucianism, I think we are dealing with a belief in other and a theology about that other and how to live life in a way that manipulates other. Certainly in Taoism, I think it's very, very explicit that we are dealing with belief in other, in its later form, quite explicitly in Grandpa Heaven. There is an other that takes a corporate form. The Tao, in a way, is part of other. It's God's way. It's communicated to human beings through Lao Tzu and the development of the Taoist religion, which then becomes the giant way, if you like, of manipulating Tao to suit us. That's what Tao Te Ching's really all about. So that balance that's there, it's not just a kind of a human balance, it's not just a nice way to live life, a kind of a moderated way of living life. It is in response to a revelation. There is a way of, controlling other in living that kind of life that's captured in the concept of yin and yang. So, and I'd be the first one happy to enter into debate with anyone about these things. None of these things is absolute. I think one of the less good things that's happened in a lot of social science, the way we've done it at schools and in universities over the last 100 years, is that we've sort of taught people to believe in absolutes. That we've now got this knowledge and here it is, and this is the way you have to understand it, and you can go out with your instruments and measure it and prove it. And I don't think when it comes to these sorts of things you can go about knowledge in that sort of way. I think we've got to enter into it and wonder and imagine and open ourselves to possibilities, debate it. My suggestion would be, and I think theology is a great discipline in which to do that. My suggestion would be that, those theologies we've looked at today, primal Indian and Asian, all fit the definition of addressing the notion of spiritual and transcendence as real, although taking different forms. They all deal with the experiences of humanity about that transcendent real, and they all deal with the ways that humanity has constructed and expressed the experience, be it orally, textually or structurally. So in that sense, there is a Hindu theology, there are primal theologies, there is a Confucian theology, I would argue. And it's through entering into the theological lens about those traditions that I think we actually come to an enhanced understanding about them. I think that's what the Chinese communists have realised in setting up the institutes of Confucian religion and dealing explicitly with issues of religion and theology in their Confucius institutes. But there was an understanding about themselves that was missing, that they had tried to kind of put away in an enforced way in the imposition of a communist ideology. And it had actually ended up fracturing a lot of Chinese self-understanding. They're now trying to blend that ancient understanding that the people had of themselves with clearly some of the good, some of the material and instrumental good that has come from communism and its ideology. Okay, any comments, any thoughts, any questions? Anything that we're not dealing with that you'd like us to deal with?
I would have liked to have seen a little bit more about the Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal, because you and I both know that when we were younger, it wasn't talked about at all in the schools. American was, so we have American stuff in our brains.
Yes.
But I'm really wanting to know more about ours.
Yeah, no, good. I mean, there are courses, of course, in the... It's probably why, I mean, any one of those case studies you could take up and do a course on. But, yeah, fortunately, it is possible to do Aboriginal studies, including quite a lot about spirituality. Yeah.
I agree with that, because I often wonder about our local area. When I was reading one of the readings, there was something about the Lake Macquarie creator God, and that really, I've got a big interest in that area, but it's very hard to find where you can go to find out, just even about the local
Yeah.
And it's definitely an area where I think even as a community that needs to be looked at, because there is no real, as far as I've looked in my own personal research, place where I didn't find this type of information yet.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And I mean, it's interesting in the many years I've been here to have seen the way Aboriginal studies has changed from, 25 years ago. It was land rights and the politics and all of that. That's still there, in part. But there's a lot more emphasis on the spirituality. And in fact, someone like Kathy Butler would say, well, you can't understand what land rights is really about anyway from an Indigenous perspective without looking at the spirituality of it. It's not just territorial claim as it can become. Yeah. Alrighty, well, thank you very much. See you online or back here or wherever. Thank you.